And what I want to talk about today is a project that I started about 4 years ago with collaboratively with Sarah Hennessy and Neil Mercer at the University of Cambridge. But this project snowballed in terms of involvement of colleagues and friends at the University of Cambridge. And I've listed a few of the cast of thousands that was involved in this study in Cambridge. And you'll see the name in the middle, Elisa Calcagni, who I think is going to speak later on today. She was heavily involved in this project. So, the project's on teacher-student dialogue and trying to pinpoint what, if anything, in patterns of teacher-student dialogue actually matters for positive student outcomes. Now, there are hundreds of studies making claims about teacher-student dialogue, and many of them pinpoint features that they think are extremely important for student outcomes. These studies are typically based on sort of casual, these ideas about what's important are typically based on sort of informal classroom observations, teacher reports, and so on. And they differ quite a lot depending on the theoretical orientation of the person doing the research. But nevertheless, they also have quite a lot in common. You know, there are some ideas that, often with terminological differences, but nevertheless, there are some ideas that have a lot in common. And I would say that across this field, although, you know, I don't want to dismiss the differences, I would have thought the ideas about what's important have more in common than they differ. But nevertheless, my conclusion after reviewing the literature in some depth was that in terms of positive consequences for outcome, the research was far less compelling than often thought. And I've listed some of the reasons why I felt that in the second half of the slide. Firstly, many of the studies, and particularly the ones looking at the relationship between, well, making claims about positive outcome, very small scale. Secondly, a lot of the studies, far from assessing the model that the author had in mind, took it for granted and just looked at the extent to which patterns of teacher-student dialogue complied with the models. The third problem was that, you know, perhaps surprisingly, dialogue wasn't even assessed in any formal sense in these studies, or outcomes weren't assessed in any formal way in the studies. And even when the two things were assessed and they were related to each other in some way or another, you couldn't really tell for certain whether anything in the teacher-student dialogue was important. I mean, often the relevant studies are based on big programs of intervention that include trying to promote things like positive group work. Now, we know group work has a significant effect on learning. It can be, you know, and we know dialogue can be important. And of course, that's crucial. But unless you take out the influence of group work in your studies, you can't tell whether it's anything the teachers are doing. Maybe it's all due to the small group. There are a lot of kind of confounding variables in the research. And finally, in the third point, rather than the fourth point, even when they've looked quite carefully at the relationship between dialogue and learning, it's sometimes impossible to say whether all the target features of dialogue, all the features that the researcher thought were important, were influencing outcomes, or only some of them. You know, they don't separate out the effects of different forms of dialogue. Some people think reasoning is important, some people think elaboration is important, some people think that bringing these things together are important. But often the programs, even when they get positive results, they don't allow us to say, well, it was that, and that, or that, but not those two. And of course, that's extremely important. So anyway, with all this as backdrop, my colleagues and I at Cambridge tried to design a study that would address some of these pitfalls. And well, I mean, we never expected to answer all the questions, but we thought we might manage to achieve something a bit more conclusive. And the study we carried out was actually very simple. It was naturalistic, very straightforward. What we did was record actual lessons, code these in accordance with current ideas about what is productive dialogue, and relate the dialogue we observed to a range of outcome measures, controlling for other potential influences. And I've already mentioned group work. We wanted to focus on teacher-student dialogue, so we controlled out the effect of group work, but we controlled other things, and I'll talk about this a little bit later. So what I'm going to do in the presentation is tell you firstly a little bit about how we recorded and analysed the dialogue, focusing on teacher-student dialogue. That was what we were interested in. Then I'll tell you what outcome measures we used, and then I'll tell you how we controlled for the potentially vast number of other influences. And finally, I'll tell you a little bit about the results and what our study indicates about positive teacher-student dialogue. The study's published. It's in the Journal of Learning Sciences that published this year. So I'm obviously going to have to skim over some of the details. But if you wanted to follow it up, that's where to find it. Okay, so let's start with dialogue. So, our database is 72 classrooms located in many regions of England. We rather hoped to get them fairly close to where we were based, but that didn't prove to be the case because teachers are very shy about being video recorded, and video recording of dialogue is absolutely crucial to our methodology. So actually it's a strength of the study in the end that we were forced to sort of move out in all directions from our base, and we had all the main geographic regions of England. Our sample is also very, very diverse in terms of socioeconomic status and ethnicity. I mean, in the UK, eligibility for free school meals is a pretty, it's a simple but pretty meaningful measure of level of deprivation. And as you'll see, some of our schools couldn't have been more deprived. 100% of the children eligible for free school meals. Some were extremely privileged, 0%. There's a big range. We were pleased about the diversity in our sample. Our analysis is based on 2 lessons from each of these 72 classrooms. We actually originally recorded 3 lessons in each classroom, but we found that so long as we had 2 academic subjects, English and maths, English and science, or maths and science, then the dialogue we observed in 2 of these lessons almost perfectly predicted the dialogue in 3. So it was a complete waste of the researchers' time to record in 3, and so we switched. in the latter part of our data collection, we only recorded in 2 classrooms, and even when we recorded in 3, we only used the data from 2. So we focused on the teacher. We were interested in teacher-student dialogue, but we recorded and analysed the teacher-student dialogue in all 3 contexts where it occurs in English classrooms. The teacher speaking to the whole class, the teacher talking to a small group after they had worked as a group, asking them what they had found out and so on, and the teacher talking to individual students, either as they were sitting at their desk and the students came up to them, or as they were walking around the classrooms talking to individuals. We had a complete record of the teacher-student dialogue during these 2 lessons. We analysed all the dialogue, and we derived variables relevant to our analysis, which was multi-level modelling. It's quite important to bear in mind that we were moving towards a quantitative approach, and that informed the way in which we analysed the dialogue. And we actually analysed the dialogue on 2 levels. Firstly, we coded every speaker turn, every contribution, and each time there was a speaker switch, we defined it as a new turn, and we coded what took place. And we used these codes. Actually, we used these codes plus one other, and the other was uncoded, which was everything we couldn't fit into one of these categories. If you can just sort of, I'll pause for a moment while you cast your eye down down the list of them and the examples. 4 of them are in a sort of fainter font than the others, and there were 2 reasons for this. All the ones that have got a C in their name were incredibly rare. So nobody really asked for the class to bring the ideas together because it wasn't invited. Nobody did it. And perhaps even rarer was the idea on the very few occasions where they did bring ideas together in the course of conversation. They very, very seldom gave reasons. Interesting. I mean, I think we coded about 80,000 turns in total. And if my memory serves me correctly, we found 17 instances of reason coordination in that database of about 80,000. Interestingly, nearly all produced by the students rather than the teachers, and nearly always when the students were telling the teachers what had happened during group work. But they were very rare. They were far too rare for us to do anything with them in our analyses. But I think that's quite important for this group here, and the reason why I'm labouring it a little bit, because these categories get at the heart of what I think is often meant by argumentation. I mean, our idea of reason coordination included ideas like counter-evidence, reasoned rebuttal, and so on. And the point is that in English classrooms, they're really not happening spontaneously at this moment in time. So we didn't have much evidence of argumentation in teacher-student dialogue. I'm quite certain, and I'll come back to this later, we had a lot of it in the small group interaction, but our focus was teacher-student. The other one that I'm sort of indicating as not very important for us was agreement. Agreement happened often, but it was correlated with every single one of these other variables. uncoded speech and reasoned speech both went hand in hand with an agreement. So there was absolutely no point in doing anything with it. So those are the codes we started with. We simplified them in various ways. Firstly, and I don't know, maybe this surprises you a little bit, we found that the frequencies of teacher dialogue in our teacher-student interactions was very, very highly correlated with the frequency of student usage of each of the codes. The frequency with which teachers reasoned was very highly correlated with the frequency with which students reasoned, okay? And so on for all the other categories. I mean, so highly correlated, correlations of plus 0.9 and bigger, they were overwhelming. So we collapsed the distinction between teachers and students. There are also some very, very strong clusters emerging in our data. So we actually collapsed basically the questions and the kind of responses that they got. And because it's quite important for what I'm going to say a little bit later, the elaborated category collapsed invitations to elaborate with the provision of elaborations. Okay, these are, again, were very, very highly, strongly clustered. Okay, so that's the term levels, but we also had lesson level scales. It's quite unusual to code at several levels in this area of research, but the ideas that were that are in the literature really recommended that we did that. So we took each of the lessons. Remember, we had 2 lessons from each of 72 classrooms. There were 144 lessons. We rated each one for these 5 variables. And in each case, because we were interested in dialogue, this is the sort of crucial thing, it was a 3-point rating scale. We gave the lesson a rating of 0 if there was no evidence of it taking place. If, for example, the teacher or the students never mentioned the aims and objectives of the lesson, they would get a rating of 0. Okay? They could get a rating of 1 if the thing took place, but it was dominated by the teacher. The teacher marches in and say, well, today we're going to be talking about evolution. They would get a score of 1 for that because there's a statement of aims, but it's completely teacher dominated. They would get a score of 2 if it took place and the students were involved. There was some sort of negotiation with the students. Now, all these scales proved to be meaningful, except for the talk rules. Reglas de habla. We couldn't do anything with that scale, much to the disappointment of my colleague Neil Mercer, because he thinks negotiation of talk rules is absolutely critical to the success of anything in this area. We seldom saw it. Now, it might have been, of course, that it had taken place earlier on in the year, and we had, it just so happened we weren't there when it happened. But because it was so rare, we couldn't do anything with it, so we had to drop that. So in the end, as regards dialogue, we had 7 turn level codes and 4 lesson levels ratings. So we've got 11 variables, okay? And these are they. I mean, elaborated, remember that's combining the invitations and the responses, likewise for reasons. Looked at the ratio of reasoned and elaborated to the non-dialogic forms. Okay, so we're wanting a ratio measure. querying and so on. Okay, so these are the dialogue variables. You don't need to take them all in, because there are one or two that I'm going to focus on a little bit more later. So, the dialogue variables. What about the outcome? What do we look at? We were wanting to relate those 11 variables to measures of student outcome. Well, we had 6 measures. The first 3 are scores on the standard attainment tests, which virtually all students in the relevant age group in England take at the end of the school year. Now, we wanted those measures because they're extremely important in the English education system. Nowadays, league tables are published showing how the schools are performing. And nowadays, the resources that are given to schools are dependent on their performance on SATs. So, these are high stakes assessment that actually we felt that if we were ever going to convince our government that these results were worth paying attention to, it would be if they showed an impact on SATs. So 3 measures of SATs. The next 2 were ones that we designed. There used to be a SAT in science too, but for various reasons it no longer exists in the UK. So we designed our own science test in collaboration with science advisors from the local schools. The test covered evolution, which I think you're going to be talking about later on, which was a topic that the teachers told us, of all the topics they could have covered, that was the one that most of them said they would cover. Then we also had a reasoning test, and we're covering, if you looked at the reasoned dialogue variable earlier on, you'll see that our reasoning test is covering the aspects of reasoning that sort of variable really ought to map onto. The student's understanding of the nature of a fact, an opinion, a reason, a conclusion, and their ability to draw a conclusion, to recognize a valid conclusion from reasons and so on. So we had a reasoning test. And then because we thought it was important not just to look at cognition, we used a published attitudinal scale, which looks at the students' beliefs about themselves as learners, looks at their attitudes to schooling, whether they're positive or not, and so on. So SAT and PASS, the attitude measure, and the high stakes exams were ones that were, sort of customized. They exist. The science test and the reasoning test were ones that we designed for the project. So, where have we got to? We've got 11 dialogue variables and 6 outcome measures. We want to relate those dialogue variables to those outcome measures. We want to relate each of those dialogue variables to each of those outcome measures. But if we simply did that, the whole thing would be pretty meaningless, because there's likely to be any number of other variables that are related to both dialogue and outcome, that if we don't take those into account, our conclusions could be very, very misleading indeed. So we needed to identify these nasty extraneous variables and control their influence in our analyses. Now, this wasn't easy. There's a massive amount of research on the correlates of student outcome. There's some research on the correlates of dialogue, but there's much more on the correlates of student outcome. And this research, as far as we could judge, had pinpointed about 150 influences that we might have to take into consideration. You know, this was mind-boggling in the challenge that it seemed to pose for us at the beginning of our project. But the more we thought about it, quite a number of them could be excluded a priori because they weren't relevant for our sample, the age group we were working with, the type of schools we were in, and so on and so forth. So we got rid of quite a lot of them. But we're still left with 32, which we assessed by a variety of measures. We assessed all 32 of them. Start of year questionnaires to the teachers, which produced our information about socioeconomic status, for example. Start of year questionnaires and to the students, and tests of the students. Very important, of course, to look at their academic performance at the start of the year as well, you know, to make sense of our end of year measures. We took observations, of the extra observations of the teacher at the time, that, you know, using the video recordings, and we observed the students during the period we were making the video recordings, and absolutely critical, of course, were the observations we made of small group work. I've said already, it was absolutely critical to find out something about small group work so we could factor it out. Now, much to our delight and surprise, we were able to eliminate virtually all of those 32 variables because they were unrelated to the dialogue, or they were unrelated to outcome in our sample. And in the end, we just had those variables that we needed to feed into the analysis as appropriate. Start of year attainment, certainly very, very important. We couldn't get rid of that, and we didn't expect to. Start of year pass scores, attitudes proved to be very important, and a factor that needed to be brought into consideration, not just when we were looking at end of year attitudes, but also when we were looking at end of year attainment. And group work, it was there, and I mean, you know, it's quite important that our results showed it was positively related to 3 of the cognitive measures, including the reasoning test, and also related to end of year pass. But from point of view of this particular project, you know, we were not looking at group work from the point of view of saying it's very important. It's from the point of view of identifying it as a control variable we needed to take into consideration in our data analyses. So, okay, we've got to the point that we've identified the variables. We've got the 11 dialogue variables, the 6 outcome measures, and 3 types of control variable that we needed to build into the analysis. 3 survivors from 150. Well, what did we find? Well, that's a summary. We found no positive relations whatsoever between teacher-student dialogue and performance on the science test or on the reasoning test, even though, as I've just said, group work was relevant to reasoning. Teacher-student dialogue wasn't. That was a bit of a disappointment for us, but it was what we found. However, SAT's performance was related to patterns of dialogue. And in particular, it was related to the levels of one of our classroom, our lesson level variables, student participation. I'm just about to tell you a bit more about what that variable involved. and either elaboration or querying. Now, student participation, remember for all these lesson level scales, we gave them a rating from 0 to 2. High student participation meant not simply that the students had opportunities to express their ideas, but they also had opportunities to comment on the ideas of others. And it was the extent to that that proved to be absolutely critical. When student participation was high levels of elaborated, asking the students to build on, the students building on other ideas, or high levels of querying, expressing doubt about someone's ideas. When student participation was high, either of those variables, both of those variables, proved to be very strongly associated with good SAT scores. But when student participation was low, elaborated and querying made no difference. And when elaborated and querying were low, student participation made no difference. It was that interaction, a critical interaction between the levels of participation and the frequency of these two variables. And the effects of elaboration and querying were additive. There was no interaction between those two. Another way of looking at I don't know if this is helpful, but it's a more quantitative way of looking at the results. Now, I better say a little bit about what this table means. Firstly, the SAT scores are standardized within quite a narrow range. So what look to be quite small differences are actually quite big differences. In addition, the figures I'm showing you are what are called estimated marginal means. They are not the real average performance, they are the means when you take start of year performance into account. So they're actually, underestimating the end of year, but they're more appropriate for present purposes. And what you can see is when E, EL and Q were above average, the top row of the table, and the student participation variable was above average, they're getting better scores. Now, as I say, but the other three combinations aren't that different, and in some cases it looks as if EL and Q, in the absence of student participation, are even slightly counterproductive. But those differences aren't significant. The key one is the significant difference between the first row and the other three. And even though those figures may look quite small, they do mean that these schools were, thousands of schools ahead of other schools, in the UK. I mean, we're talking about a normal distribution within a narrow range. And these are nationwide measures. So they are quite marked. It's probably maybe not the best, but here's an example of where high levels of participation. The students are commenting on these ideas. The teacher's certainly scaffolding it, but what's happening? It's a very, very brief extract, but there's Chris and Jack taking part, and Chris is commenting on Jack's idea. He's not simply responding to the teacher. So it's that sort of thing. They're talking about the difference between direct and indirect speech in this extract. So what about PASS? I've told you about the cognitive measures. What about PASS? With PASS, we did find some significant main effects. The frequency of elaborated, again, coming up. This time the elaborated to non-dialogic ratio and also the reason to non-dialogic ratio were all positively were all positively associated with pass scores. But unfortunately, there was an interaction effect, such that if querying was highly frequent, it completely eliminated the positive effect of the two ratio measures. Now that's slightly bad news, because I've just told you high levels of querying were very helpful as regards cognition. But the encouraging story here is that there was no significant interaction between querying and elaboration as regards an effect on pass. So the very variable that a moment ago I told you was important for cognition remains important for attitudes and isn't compromised by the effect of querying. So again, we're seeing elaboration coming through. Querying, although it has some negative effects as regards attitude, it doesn't have a negative effects when it's in collaboration with elaboration. So there's a story here, and I'll just show you a few more slides to kind of wrap it all up and draw some implications. Here's a summary of some of the main points. As regards teacher-student dialogue, remember I'm only talking about teacher-student dialogue today, high levels of elaboration and querying boost academic performance if they're in context of high student elaboration. I mean, I've been doing lots of elaboration as I've been talking here, but this would be precisely the non-productive thing, because you haven't been interacting with me and you haven't been commenting on each other's ideas. That's a difference. Elaboration doesn't have to happen in a dialogic way, but when it does happen in a dialogic way, it's important. As regards teacher-student dialogue, high levels of elaboration boost academic attitudes, and as I've just shown you, that's regardless of levels of querying. Teacher-student dialogue has little effect on reasoning skills in our sample, but group dialogue turns out to be very important. And of course, group dialogue was important for other academic measures too. So I've got 3 more slides, which I'll go over quickly because I think time's running out. Talk briefly about the implications for theory, the implications for methodology, and the implications for practice. I think the centrality of elaboration, querying, and student participation are certainly consistent with some models in the literature. I think Robin Alexander's 5 principles, would welcome them. Martin Nystrom's dialogic spells, I think variables very like these feature in his writing too. So I can identify sources in the literature that our findings map onto for sure. But I think the real problem is the absolute absence of any positive effects of reasoned dialogue. Neither the RE variable nor the one that looks as a ratio to non-dialogic proved to be positively related to anything. And that wasn't anything to do with the distributional properties of the data. I mean, the average usage was roughly once a minute, and there was a big range across classrooms. I think it might be something, that the rarity of reasoned coordination may give us a clue here, because that's suggesting that even though reasoned dialogue was quite frequent, it didn't occur in a context of argumentation, whereas it probably did in the small group context. And I think that might well be a critical difference and a critical, limitation on teacher-student dialogue as it currently occurs in England. What about methodology? Well, I think, I emphasize that this is a naturalistic study. We looked at dialogue as it actually currently occurs in English classrooms. And I think that's got lots of advantages. But, of course, it does mean we can't say much about the things that don't happen very often. The coordination, what I said just 1 minute ago, suggests that that ought to be probed a little bit more. Talk rules indicated how they were so close to Neil's heart earlier on, and again we couldn't explore their influence. You probably need to do intervention studies to examine the effect of these. In other words, you can do so much with naturalistic studies, but you can't do everything. The second methodological point I want to make is that we emphasized the dialogue on 2 levels. Now, ages ago, Dale Hymes, argued that that was essential for making sense of dialogue, that you should take a multi-level approach to coding. It's really rare in this field. Most researchers code at what one might call the micro level, the level of the turn, the level of the utterance. We think that, those interactions between the SP variable and the EL and Q variables, a lesson level variable and a turn level variable, really hammers home the importance of coding on 2 levels. And finally, the implications for practice. Now, in this field, if you start reading in any depth whatsoever, you will find many, many reports of teacher professional development trying to implement dialogic methods in classrooms. They almost always are extremely intense, small scale, involving a massive amount of intervention. And there are real issues about both sustainability and scalability. Now, it may be that at this point in time we're trying to be too ambitious. And whereas I wouldn't necessarily want to say that our pinpointing of elaboration, querying and student participation are definitive, the fact that they have emerged pretty strongly as positive variables, and there are only 3 of them, perhaps we might make some progress in terms of sustainable teacher professional development if we just focus in on a few variables at a time. The other implication for practice is that, of course, group work amongst students was incidental as regards the results of this particular project, but it certainly emerged as an important and highly supported form of interaction. And I think, as we're thinking about the practical implications, we should think about how positive group work can be coordinated with encouraging teachers to use a form of dialogue that I've been talking about. So that's enough, I think, for now. Thank you very much.